Anniversary of the death of George Floyd, which catalysed a movemental response in conversation, in examination of history, of institutions and of self. And as the Church of Scotland, here in Scotland, where most of us are based today, there's been a lot of work going on behind the scenes to ensure that we're taking seriously the call to examine the way that we operate, to be the inclusive, diverse church that we want to be. And that really important work that's going on behind the scenes will show itself more and more in the months and years to come. But we've been conscious and said that we want to help the conversations happening at local church level now. And so we've, over the last few months, been able to engage with that through our Ascend mailings. But today, with this session, More Than a Colour, we want to really engage in two-way conversations and introduce people to one another into this dialogue across the nation and across the church. So we're really glad to have Krish with us today. This is a conversation that he has been really significant in helping the church to engage with over the last few months, but we have been conscious that there hasn't been a large engagement from Scotland yet, and so today we wanted to bring that conversation here. Krish is passionate about building relationships across organisations and institutions, across all aspects of society, so that we might begin to make progress in some of the areas that are really problematic for us as a society and as a nation. And I know from knowing Krish for a number of years, he gets really passionate when he's in any position to help the church fulfil its calling to be everything that God's made it to be. And so we'll hear something of that from him today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before I hand back fully to Krish. We'd ask, if you possibly can, through this session, to keep yourself on mute unless it's time for you to speak. So please, it's easier on Teams if you keep a good track of that for us. Claire Milrin and I are going to be keeping an eye on the chat box throughout. So that is a place for you to make comment. It is a place for you to ask questions. We have asked Krish to make sure that at least the last 15 minutes are fully available for Q&A, and we'd like that to be a full engaging time. And our intention is to record this session today, and so if you have any difficulty with that, if you could just pop something either in Teams as a direct message to Claire Milrin or in the chat box just now, and we'll go ahead and record, but we would keep back that recording if there was any real reason for you to object to it. Our plan is not to make it widely available, but rather to the one or two folks who had planned to be here today but haven't been able to come. So that is all the housekeeping I think I have for you just now. Krish, can I hand back to you, please?
Thank you, Kate. It's lovely to be working with you again. We worked together a long time ago. You're still looking very young and fresh, so it's nice to see you. And I'll introduce you to Makami in a minute. Let me begin with a story. My mother was born in India. Her father was born in Ireland. My father was born in Malaysia. His father was born in Sri Lanka. So I consider myself a multicultural person. And my mother was brought up in an orphanage in India. She was brought up in an orphanage because she was a product of a biracial marriage between a white person and a brown person. And that the white person was her dad, and he died in the Second World War fighting against Rommel in El Alamein for the Allies. And he was awarded the Military Cross, which was the second highest award that you could get as a British soldier at that time. And he has a war grave somewhere in North Africa. I hope one day to visit it. But he left behind 3 daughters and a widow. And because the daughters were mixed race, dual heritage, we might say today, but what they were called back then was a pretty offensive term now. It was called half caste. They didn't fit anywhere. They weren't brown enough to be accepted into the Indian community, and they weren't white enough to be welcomed into the expat British community, and or the Raj, you might call it. And so they were shipped off to orphanages because better to not be seen or heard by the majority. there's a longer conversation to be had about orphanages. If you want to have that conversation, I'm really open to it, but we're focusing on race today. So my mum and her two sisters were in different orphanages. They were discovered by an auntie in England, in Brighton. And this auntie decided to bring the girls over one by one and help them set up life in the UK rather than have them grow up in an orphanage. And my mother, as a teenager, decided to train as a nurse. And she used to go up to the hospital, and sometimes she used to catch the bus. She was nervous about catching the bus because she was often given kind of racist taunts. People thought they were being very clever when they said, "Why haven't you got a dot on your head like all the other Indians? That dot is what you do when someone says go back or go black to your own country." Or sometimes people would throw a banana at her. Sometimes the patients wouldn't let my mother touch them. They said, "We'd rather have a white nurse." Maybe they were worried the brown would rub off. But my mother decided to fight racism with hospitality, and this has become a theme of my life. And so what she would do was, on a Friday night, she would open up her home and she'd cook up a large vat of curry and rice, and anyone that didn't feel like they fit in, they were welcome at my mother's house. And whether that was an international student or another nurse or just someone from the community, they found welcome in my mother's house. My mother was a one-woman resistance campaign, and it rubbed off on me. I can see Fiona nodding along. She tasted some of my mother's cookery when my mother was alive. So this idea that we can undo some of the horrible attributes of racism through hospitality, I think is an incredibly powerful Christian mindset. And I want us to get to what that means for you as a kind of church leader as we go through. But I just wanted to start with that story to help you understand why this stuff matters to me and my family. I have an even more multicultural family now. I'm married to Miriam, who's half English and half Welsh. We have 6 children between us. 3 are our birth children and 3 are fostered or adopted. They are a mix of different races, all born in the UK, but from different ethnic backgrounds. And we want our home to be a little foretaste of the coming kingdom of God. And I think for me, that's what the church is supposed to be on this issue of race. We're supposed to be a foretaste of the coming kingdom of God. But before we go any further, I'd really like you to meet someone who's become, well, I've been really inspired by already. Her name is Makami Makrum, and we only met for the first time on Friday, but I was delighted she was able to join me today for this seminar. Makami is originally from Kenya, and but has been in Scotland for many years now. She's a human rights, race and gender campaigner. She's a member of her local church in Linlithgow, but she's speaking in her own private capacity today. She also got lots of experience with the World Council of Churches and been on a number of commissions there. Makami, would you like to come off mute and let me ask you a little bit of some of your experiences within Scotland and maybe the Scottish Church? This issue of talking about race and racism, how has that impacted your experience of life in Scotland and in the Scottish Church?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction. And can I first of all say how amazed at your own experiences, which really echo the life of many people I have come across. I came from Kenya in the 70s, and I grew up in a Presbyterian church. And we had this, Kenya had just become independent, so the church was really important as a place for hope for people, and a place where you felt at home, second from your own home, especially if you didn't have a home, so to speak of, because of the disruption of the struggle for independence. And coming to Scotland, I brought with me that same passion, that hope, that feeling of, and I had to immediately look for a Presbyterian church. And I was expecting the same kind of hospitality, the welcome the stranger, and that sense of belonging, especially since I had left my family back home. It was just me, my husband, who was Scottish, and my son. And therefore, it was very painful to find rejection, or being sometimes very subtle. You see, one good thing about Christians is that we rarely are overt in the way we speak to other people, but we can be as damaging in our silence, in our subtle way of making you feel you don't belong. For example, going and sitting at the wrong pew in church. By tradition, we never sit at the front in our churches, so we weren't at the front row, but we're somewhere in the middle. We didn't realize there were pews which were designated to different people. And we were people, the owners of the pew did not say anything, but they stood in the aisle, and then somebody came and told us to move. So it was a really embarrassing and humiliating experience because we didn't know what we had done. And immediately I thought it was because I'm black, you know, that I couldn't see anything else. I was a Christian. I had my husband and my son. Why else would I be asked to move and go back to the back row? And then next time we went to church, we sat at the back. But we noticed nobody sat, the pew was always empty. There were 3 of us, the rest was space. People would squash into pews rather than sit next to us. And if we sat next to people, they would move away. And when I asked, I was told, oh, they're giving you space. This is what I mean about how we interpret that sort of really subtle hostility. They are giving you. My son and my husband needed very small space, so a pew that takes 6 people, there was no reason for anybody to move. But those, I only noticed that when other people, when I got to know other people from Africa and a few from India, that I realized that we were being treated differently from other people. We were never called any names at all. This is why I like people to understand racism is not just about name calling, because people tend to think, oh, we will never call you names, we will never throw stones at your windows or break windows, or they leave that to other people. But it was still real. And then I realized my son going to Sunday school was being treated differently, and he from a very early age he hated going to Sunday school because he said he was being shouted at all the time, and if he played with other kids he was told to go and do something at the corner alone, and it was really hurtful because, as I said, I thought I had come home, and I could not envisage at any point a house of God with all the scriptures about created in the image of God, welcoming the stranger. All those things to me were contrary to what I experienced in my early days. In time, I started fighting back because I think I tell people I was trained. I came here as a teacher. I was trained I used to work as a teacher in Kenya. So campaigning was something I went into by default. Really, it was a resistance. First of all, my resistance was not to go to church for about 7 years, which was very difficult. I used to lie to my mother because she kept asking, are you going to church? Yes, but I would take my son to Sunday school and then go back home. Until I started meeting other people and we were asking questions. A good friend of mine called Uma was also involved in that. And other people were making little noises here and there, and the Church of Scotland, I think, started a group called a working group on racism way back in the 90s, and I think that was also to do with external factors. You know, other World Council, Krish mentioned World Council of Churches. They had a whole program on to combat racism because of especially apartheid, fighting against apartheid. Church of Scotland was involved in fighting apartheid. And there was Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe. We had Churches Commission for Racial Justice, which was part of CTBI, and all those were putting pressure on the church to respond. But the response was, again, met with very subtle hostility. I was asked to chair one of the committees on a working group which led to the formation of SCARJ, which was Scottish Churches Agency for Racial Justice. And chairing that was very painful for me, because all the members of the church who were either selected or elected to be on a committee, some of them made my life hell. I was not following the procedures. I was a lay person, and what right did I have to interject or to bring issues to church? And it became very difficult, because I told them racism does not follow boundaries or structures or systems or rules the committee follows. It doesn't matter how you experience it. Out there, nobody says, I'm going to now kick you because of this procedure. You know, it does not. So I did not see how we had to be so rigid in following some protocols to challenge racism. Perhaps you can ask me more questions, because I think I'm going on too much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Makami. That was so helpful to hear, just your experiences, and we all will come back to you as we go through our time together. There'll be opportunities for Q&A as we go through. But let me just give you, I guess, 10 big ideas that I think it might be useful for us to think about, and then we'll throw it open for some Q&A. And I'll zip through them at speed, but you should be able to see some of them on your screen, because I've made a PowerPoint. Hopefully that's all going to just work swimmingly. Here it is. Okay, 10 ways churches can pursue racial justice, and they're all going to begin with R, because I'm a Baptist, and that's what we do. And alliteration is the theme of our time today. I think the first thing we've got to do is recognise the challenge. I've noticed some people say, well, you know, things have changed. The experience that Makami just told you about, well, that wouldn't happen today. Well, sadly, it does still happen today, but this idea about what racism looks and feels like, that's important. Makami mentioned, you know, it's not just about name calling. There do seem to be some systemic disparities across the UK. So, for example, 60% of black people in the UK do not believe their health is as equally protected by the NHS compared to white people. That's across the whole of the United Kingdom. That has huge implications for things like whether people feel comfortable going to get the vaccine. And if you don't go to get the vaccine, then we've got another kind of public health issue, haven't we, about how we deal with this pandemic. So racism, it's in everyone's best interest to sort out racism, because if people felt comfortable using the healthcare system, then that's good for everybody. But if they don't, then that's bad for everybody. So these have huge implications. The death rate for black women in childbirth is 5 times higher than that for white women. The impact on the black community of COVID-19 has been disproportionately more severe. Some people say that's due to underlying health conditions, but also disparities in poverty and affluence. 85% of black people are not confident that they will be treated the same as a white person by the police. And there's been a 300% increase in race-based hate crimes towards East and Southeast Asians. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. One of the areas that I'm particularly involved is around adoption and fostering. Black children across the UK are overrepresented in the care system. So when you look at the percentages of black children in the UK, there's more than the national percentage of black children in care. And black children wait the longest for adoption in the UK and are the least likely group of children to get adopted at all. And so this is an event that we did at 10 Downing Street. I invited some friends to talk with the government about how we go about fixing that. And I now have a job, because of that meeting, helping the government fix adoption. We've got a big summit coming up next week because the US government and the UK government both recognise we have a problem that black children are waiting the longest in both of our nations. So what could we do to end that racial disparity? Yeah, I just mentioned that. So we need to recognise there is a problem, and that problem is more subtle than some people realise. Let's talk about 4 different levels of racism. Oh, sorry, it's because I translated it to PowerPoint. So let's talk about internalised, interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism. So an internalised racism is when you either consciously or unconsciously have a prejudice towards people of a different race. That's just you on your inside. Now, you might choose to recognise that and deal with it, brilliant, or it might spill over into the way that you treat other people. And again, it's subtle. Some people have said, you know, only white people can be racist. I don't think that's true. I think all sorts of people can be racist. I noticed it in myself. So someone came to my door not long ago and they offered to fix my driveway. They had an Irish accent. Because of their Irish accent, I'm more suspicious. I caught it in myself. I'm more suspicious that they won't do a good job, that they're probably going to fleece me, was my expectation. That's before I know anything about the company, I know anything about the person, I haven't checked any references, I have that inbuilt prejudice because of how Irish people are portrayed in the media and in kind of common parlance. So you can choose to act out your internalized racism towards other people. But sometimes, as we've seen that already, an institution, maybe a football club or a school or a church, might have some systems in place that are prejudicial. Some cultures, some ways we go about speaking about things, the people we put up the front, what our kind of normal practices are, that can become an institutional form of racism. That doesn't mean everyone in the institution is racist, but you've built in some practices and some standard operating procedures that discriminate or treat people differently because of their ethnicity. And finally, structural racism is the idea that it's not just one church or one football club or one school, but it could be the whole education system. And we've seen that in the UK, for example, that black children are more likely to be expelled or excluded from school than white children. And it's often over different types of behaviours, different levels of behaviour. Bad behaviour, I guess, would lead to an expulsion for someone from a black background than it would for a white background. So some people then say, well, that means education or the police force is structurally racist. So there are different levels, and it's possible that you're not hearing the name calling. It's not visible in a kind of above the water level approach. But those systems are still there that are biasing the way that people are treated. You've probably seen something like this pop up on your social media feed. It's trying to help you understand the differences in the way that people are starting life. And you might have heard words like privilege. Privilege is a bit of a loaded word. It's become politically loaded. The Westminster government produced a race report. I think it was a race report for the whole United Kingdom, but a lot of those that participated were based in the South, and it mentioned words like privilege and white privilege, white fragility as being trigger words. But still there is an issue in that someone might be born into a life circumstance that puts them at a disadvantage. So if it's been shown, for example, people applying for jobs in the civil service, if their name looks like it might be an African name, they are less likely to be offered an interview when the same CV is put forward with an English name. So those disadvantages are demonstrated in the kind of far left picture, the reality. So we're not all starting from the same place. We all have different levels of advantage and disadvantage. And race isn't the only issue that there is advantage and disadvantage. It can be true about gender. It can be true about age. It can be true about education. But race is the one that we're looking at today. So some people think we just all need to give people equality. Let's give them all the same starting points. Let's give people the same ways of overcoming the disadvantage. But if you give everybody the same, then depending on where you started from, that doesn't help so much, as you can see that in the equality picture. But equity is trying to say, well, working out what disadvantages people actually have means that you can compensate for that in the way that systems are built. And then liberation is the idea that you take down the wall in the first place. I quite like this picture as well, because again, there are lots of different things that disadvantage people, and one of the ones that gets most overlooked isn't always race. Actually, it's normally disability. So that's an important thing that we as a church, if we're going to be this inclusive, welcoming community, really needs to deal with. So we need to kind of recognize there's a problem, and sometimes Christians don't do that. We're worried that this whole conversation is just one that's driven by ideas that are foreign or outside of the kind of Christian worldview. I've heard people criticize this conversation about racial disparity by just saying it's just really woke, isn't it? It's just trendy, it's of the moment, and we don't want to be blown about, as it says in Ephesians. I think, we don't be blown about by every wind of idea or doctrine. We want to be kind of steadfast to what we're called to do. Interestingly, Bishop Tom Wright, who was the Bishop of Durham, wrote a piece for The Spectator recently, arguing it's not woke to care about racial justice, it's our original calling. In Ephesians 2, it says that Jesus brought down the dividing wall that separated Jew from Gentile. There was this ethnic divide in the ancient world between the chosen people of God and everybody else. But also that worked the other way around. Sometimes people who were from a Roman background or a Greek background looked down on other people because their cultures, they thought, weren't as developed, and they included the Jewish nation in that. So there was a mutual antipathy. But somehow in the church, God called together this multicultural community to demonstrate his multifaceted glory and grace. And so it's always been on the church's agenda, as given by God, that we are supposed to demonstrate that the love of God crosses every boundary. The most famous verse in the Bible, John chapter 3, verse 16, says, "For God so loved middle class white people." No, that's not right. Scratch that. "For God so loved the world." Every single person on this planet is loved by God. Whatever your ethnicity, whatever your age, whatever your abilities, whatever your gender, your sexuality, or even your faith, God has love for the world. The world has not responded to that love appropriately, but God has love for the world. So if the church doesn't demonstrate that border crossing, ethnicity crossing, ability crossing love of God, we are contradicting the gospel. And therefore we've got to recognize there's a problem in order to be able to deal with it. All right, let's talk about just a couple more issues. I think we do need to rethink the language. I've been into a lot of church contexts where people have said, you know what, I just don't see colour. As a Christian, I don't see colour. They're kind of riffing on the idea in Galatians, I think it's 3:28, where it says, "In Christ there is no longer slave or free, Jew or Gentile, male or female." And at one level, there's an element of truth there, isn't it? That we are all loved by God, independent of our ethnicity. And so we are, in the best sense of the word, we believe that God's love is bigger than any ethnic divide. But if you say to somebody that you don't see colour, what is heard, however good your intentions, is that something that's actually quite important to someone's identity is not being recognised by you. And even worse than that something that might be causing somebody to be oppressed or treated unjustly is not important to you. Imagine you were standing outside of your church building on Sunday, and someone who uses a wheelchair comes up to you, and you say to them, "Oh, in our church, we don't recognise disability. We don't see disability." Now, again, what you might mean is something positive, that everybody's welcome. But actually what's heard is you don't see some of the struggles that I've faced. And chances are you haven't got a church building that's able to receive me, because you haven't thought about what it's like being in a wheelchair and therefore you probably haven't got great access, you probably haven't got great visibility when it comes to where the seating arrangements are. So when we say to people we don't see colour, however well intentioned that is, it can be really offensive and really unhelpful. It's the same with the concept of all lives matter. I don't know if you heard people say that when the Black Lives Matter campaign came out. And I think, again, there's an element of truth. Every single life does matter on the planet, and God loves the world. But in this cultural moment, what is heard is a rejection of the challenges that people of colour are facing right now. And so therefore it kind of aligns more with a kind of right-leaning politics, which again might be an unintended consequence of using language like that. It's a little bit like there was a death recently. Do you remember a lady, I think her name was Sarah Everard, was abducted on her way home from, she'd just been out, I think it was 9 o'clock. She was in the Clapham area of London. She was abducted, later found to have been murdered. And there was a mass outpouring of empathy and grief and fear from women across the UK. And a lot of people started kind of hashtags talking about, how vulnerable women felt. Now, if men were to enter that conversation and say, well, men get abducted too, and men are often abused and killed, it comes across as being tonally and culturally deaf, as if you're belittling the experiences of women, and actually comes across as really sexist. So again, how we use language is really quite important as we enter this debate, and therefore, we need to be really mindful and accurate, I think, in what we're saying. Okay, I think we've got to revisit our past. Makami mentioned, what happened to her in the 1970s as part of the East African migration to the UK. A friend of mine, Chinny McDonald, has just got a great book out called God Is Not a White Man. She came to the UK with her family in the 80s and had exactly the same experience as Makami. Sadly, I took a young man to a church in the noughties, so to the 2000s. And before he even entered the building, someone managed to insult him. I just said, hi, this is my friend Rishi. And the guy on the door said, Rishi, Dishi, Mishi. That's a funny name, isn't it? I'm going, seriously? You don't realize how long a journey it's been for me to get this guy from a Hindu background to even consider crossing the boundary of a church. And you've already insulted him before we've got into the building. I think we've also got to revisit the past, because the past has a long shadow on the present. If your parents or if you were rejected from the church, it's going to take a lot of bridge building to be able to welcome people into the church again. I think we in the UK have a history that we need to deal with as we look at the world. Every time I sit down and have dinner with my family, I'm reminded of colonialism, because we've got a kind of floor to ceiling world map on our kitchen wall. And there are straight lines all over Africa that don't make any geographical sense. It's because someone in a drawing room in Europe, and a lot of those drawing rooms were in the UK, decided that certain tribes and groups couldn't be one nation anymore. We were going to draw a line through their countries and decide who was our protectorate, who was our colony, and who wasn't. And a lot of the conflict that kind of continues in many parts of Africa, that's a colonial export that we brought. And so, a lot of the ongoing poverty in parts of Africa is part of the UK's relationship with the rest of the world. And so these are not just things in the past that are good for history books, they have current implications, and therefore we need to face up to them. Okay. There's some of the preliminaries. Let me dive in a bit, and then I'm going to throw it open for some questions so you're not just listening to me all the time. I think one of the ways that we need to fight racism is through representation. I don't know if you watched President Biden's inauguration ceremony. I don't know where you guys stand on your politics. I know I think Mr. Trump owns a golf course in a certain part of Scotland. I don't know if that means anything for Scottish politics. I wasn't a huge fan of Mr. Trump, it must be said, President Trump. And so I was delighted when Biden won the election, and he deliberately chose this incredible young poet to be the national poet on this most important of his days. This is Amanda Gorman. And there were millions of people watching, and there was such a sense of celebration that a young black woman would be the voice of America at that moment, talking about a different way of doing life, what the future could be. And there's this concept that comes with it, see it to be. I need to see someone doing something. I need to see someone in leadership or in authority in order to think it's possible for me to be there too. Many churches across the world, but also in the UK, they are multicultural in who turns up on a Sunday morning, but they're monocultural when it comes to the leadership. And that is another form, if we're not careful, of colonialism, that we're somehow saying that white people are more qualified or more gifted, and therefore they should be in leadership, or everyone else should just be there in attendance. And so there are really important ways that we as churches need to represent our diversity. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, I live in a very rural part of Scotland. There literally are no ethnic minorities in my community. Well, I would say a few things there. One is that diversity is not just limited to ethnicity. What are the other areas of diversity that you do have within your community? I live in Oxfordshire. I live in a small market town, and there are some very wealthy people in my town, and there are some very poor people in my town. There are some very educated people in my town, and there are people that really struggle with education. But if you look at the leadership of our churches, it's often one particular group. It's often very male, and it's often very educated, and it's often very middle class. What are the ways we've got to kind of mix it up that way? But we'll come on to how you might, in a rural context, develop a more multicultural team. Let's get to there in a moment. Oh, I'll tell you what, I'll do this one and then I'll pause, because I want you to have a chance to ask some questions before I give you the last 5 in quick succession. I don't know if you've ever seen this book. It's called 10 Boys Who Changed the World. I was excited to buy it for my kids and read it to them at bedtime. I wanted my boys to change the world. But then I realized who the boys are, who gets to be on the list of Christian heroes. They are pretty much all white, British or American leaders, and often cross-cultural missionaries who've gone to other places. It's almost like God was never doing anything outside of the Western world. And it needed to be the Western world that brought the gospel to the rest of the world. Well, we know that's true, not true even from the Bible itself. So how have we developed this kind of white savior complex within Christian history? We need a bigger picture. My wife and I have just got excited about that. And so we've shameless plug here. We've written, oh, you probably can't see that. Why can't you see that? I don't know. We've written a book. I'll share it in the chat. Because when I grew up, I thought every single person in the Bible was white. That was every stained glass window I ever saw. It's every film about Jesus I ever saw. It's Charlton Heston being Moses. You know, what's going on? But when you read the Bible, hardly anyone is white. So how can I help children around the UK and around the world realize that God can take them and use them, whatever their ethnic background? So we've written a book of retellings of Bible stories that celebrates the fact that you've got a senator from Sudan, you've got a brave refugee from Jordan, you've got a super spy from Syria, all being used by God for his purposes in the very pages of the Bible. And we've got a great illustrator who's kind of highlighting the fact there is this incredible ethnic diversity even in the pages of the Bible. Right, I want to give you my last 5 in a minute, but I do want to give you lots of space to ask some questions. So let me stop sharing for a minute, and then you can ask some questions. Am I still sharing? Maybe I'm not.
You are, Krish.
Oh, how do I turn that off? All right, I'll turn it off while you'll think of some questions.
So feel free to unmute and to ask, or to pop something in the chat. You can do it either way.
Stop presenting, there it is.
Might be a question you came with, might be something that has risen up because of something that Krish has said. Don't be shy.
Hi, it's Folu here.
Oh, hi, Folu. Go for it.
And the question for me is a little bit personal. And it seems as if, people of color are pretty much most of the time are being asked to do the homework about educating white people. And it's always a constant, we work hard at not being, at being accepted. But when it comes to educating white people about racism, it seems to always fall on people of color to educate white people. And in churches, and I come from a local church here in Peterborough. I strongly feel that we keep leaving the job to Black people to do the education. How do we get our leaders to actually be the ones who educate themselves? Let us know they're educating themselves, and then share, whatever it is, the knowledge that they've gained or whatever research they've done, to be able to tell Black people or people of color, listen, we've done research, we've done X, Y, Z, we understand these issues. And secondly, how do we get them to, as it were, provide seminars like this, so that it's not just a group of the church hearing, Black people or people of color, or, how do we get them to, as it were, not shy away from the congregation hearing this issue?
Thanks, Folu. Really, really helpful question. and lots of my friends would echo that sentiment, that they're tired. They're tired of being the expert, and they're the ones that have to do the work to catch everybody up when they're on the receiving end of a lot of the injustice and oppression. So, don't ask me to do anything. It's just hard enough kind of living life, turning up at church, trying to be a good follower of Jesus. I really hear that. I think that the flip side of it is, I've met many white pastors who have just woken up. It's taken something like the Black Lives Matter movement or George Floyd in order for them to wake up. And part of me goes, where have you been? Why has it taken this event? Surely it's in the Bible. Why didn't you see it? Well, I realize in myself that I was blind to much of the Bible for a lot of my Christian life. And sometimes God uses external events to wake us up to things. I remember watching the Live Aid concert as a teenager, and I should have cared about global poverty before that, but it took that event to make me think, oh my goodness, I need to do something. So these triggering events that can awaken people, part of me says, well, better late than never. That's great. But once a white pastor has been woken up to these issues, their challenge then is, okay, if I try to lead on this, I don't have the lived experience, so who am I to speak into this? I know often that doesn't stop a lot of preachers from speaking about all sorts of subjects, but I'm trying to narrate how I've heard it explained to me. Who am I to speak about this? And one of the critiques is that we've silenced Black voices from the conversation. So I understand why now these now woken up Christian leaders want to involve the voices of people of color in the conversation, but I understand why it's also tiring. I think what I've been noticing is there's a greater emphasis on what I describe as co-design. So instead of white leaders designing a program to help the church deal with racism, they're worried they might bring their own prejudice into that conversation. And so there's more of an openness now to say, okay, how can we do this together? So it isn't Black leaders telling everybody and being lent on for all their expertise, and it isn't white leaders speaking without their lived experience, but together trying to design something that will be mutually beneficial and helpful. I think that might be the way forward, and it will mean asking people like you, Folu, who sounds like you've had a tough time, even though you've been through all these difficult things, to still keep engaging with this church that's kind of slow on the uptake. But thanks for raising. Just before I come back and well, does anyone else want to ask something similar, or do you want to go on a different tack? What other questions would you like to ask, just so you've all had a chance? And it might be you want to address one to me or Makami or someone else that's on the call.
I've got a question in the chat, Krish, from Josiah, who says this might be simply semantics, but how do we change the colloquial language which makes a distinction between white people and people of colour? Would we not classify being white as being a person of colour?
Yeah, it's a good point. And again, maybe Makami's got a view on that. So you're right, at one level, even the word race is an interesting one, because race has a history to it, and a history that is actually quite unhelpful. It was used as a kind of classification system of human development through a kind of evolutionary frame. And the people that were using that language obviously put people they classified as white at the kind of top of the developmental journey, and everyone else somewhere below, you know, and sadly they put black people on the bottom, and Asian and maybe Middle Eastern people in the middle, and then, you know, we finally get to the pinnacle of whiteness. So there's a lot of language that does need revisiting, I think, and the language changes quickly. So, you know, when I was a kid, people used to call me coloured, which is incredibly offensive now. I think it was offensive then, but I just didn't have the vocabulary to know. People of colour does seem to be language that is more prevalent in America, partly due to a kind of revival, I think positively, the kind of black is beautiful. People are comfortable with using the word black about themselves. And it does seem that white people often use whiteness about themselves too. But that is an important thing that you might want to do in a one-on-one conversation about these things. Agree the terms. You know, what terms can we use? I don't want to be offensive. What terms might I use that will help this conversation to move forward? So as you say, we're not just falling out over semantics. But Makami, have you got a perspective on the use of the word white?
Well, not perhaps white, but color in general. The terms that are being used now, many people find them offensive in the sense that they can also exclude people of the different ethnicity, and they also hide your own identity. For example, the history, if you look at the evolution of the terminology in UK, we keep changing terms because we are uncomfortable. When people are uncomfortable with calling people black, they would look for another. They said colored was a nicer word, and people said no, it's we don't like it. It's insulting. The roots, the back to South Africa and the deep south of America, or the terms were never used to in a complimentary way. People of color, some people do feel it's a sanitized version of colored, so they are asking people to name you according to your ancestry, your origins, and also we also must take into account, like my children have got African and Scottish roots, therefore, and they do describe themselves as never black enough or white enough, so the colors confuse their identity, and they prefer to call themselves African Scots because of that identity. And it's good to ask people how they want to be defined, but blanket terms always make some people feel left out. BMA, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, immediately leaves Chinese and Africans out, because black does not necessarily refer to everybody of African continent.
Yes, that's right.
It's better to have, people have said, let's call minority ethnic or ethnic minority is a matter of time and place. When I'm in Africa, I'm not a minority, and therefore here in Scotland, and you white people in Scotland will be minority, and therefore you would recognize it's a question of numbers, but it's more comfortable for people to link that in terms of numbers rather than in terms of color, defining your ethnicity or your identity, because they don't.
That's helpful, Makami. That's right. I'm finding people more comfortable with ethnicity than race because of the history of the term race. And I liked your idea about timing, that you're a minority in some contexts and not others. Mandy's got her hand up.
Yeah, I was just picking up on Makami's point that she's popped in the chat, and just going back to, you were talking about people, speaking and about race and racism and the issues. I think, yeah, it is important that, when we ask people to be involved or to speak out, that there's support there, because it's as soon as you put your head above the parapet and you speak about it, you leave yourself wide open for any kind of attack, yes, abuse, and I think that, we ask people for their support, we ask people to speak out, but do we actually give support when they do? Because what comes when you do is, yeah, quite incredible. Even within a church setting, you would be amazed by some of the stuff that goes on, and that you then leave yourself wide open to. And in this day and age of social media, people can post what they like and walk away, and you're left to deal with it. And so I think, yeah, we want the conversations to happen. We want people to be engaged. We ask, people from ethnic minority groups to be involved in it, but do we support them when they are, or do we just leave them high and dry?
Thank you, Mandy. It sounds like you've experienced some pretty tough things as you've tried to help that conversation along. So thank you so much for joining us today and being part of this. Great. Any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to give you 5 other things in 5 minutes, just so that you've got completeness. Do you fancy that? I'm not even sure my numbering was correct earlier, but let me give you the lowdown. So we talked about recognizing the challenge, rethinking language, revisiting the past, re-educating the young. I want to talk about rebooting. We talked about representing diversity. I want to talk about rebooting worship. It's interesting when we come together as a church, and often we come together for kind of hymn singing, prayer, and preaching. And there's a whole other conversation to be had about whether mission should be our reason for gathering, and all these other things happen as a result. That's another conversation. But when we gather together for worship, it's interesting, the music that we choose, even when we've got a diverse congregation, is often generated in the West. It's almost as if there's never been any useful music created anywhere else on the planet. And it's interesting because you can travel to many places on the planet and hear those same English songs marketed by large multinational corporate companies everywhere in the world. So you go to Malaysia, you go to Australia, you go to Mexico, you can go to Kenya, and you'll probably hear some Hillsong, some Bethel, some, within the kind of charismatic tradition, or you'll hear a lot of Wesley and Watts and all the other kind of great British hymn writers. So you're going, okay, well, is there a way that we can reboot this and allow more organic local music to develop? One of my favorite pictures of this is the origins of jazz music. Jazz music happened in New Orleans because there was terrible slavery that had brought people from Africa to America, but some had been classically trained as musicians along the way. And so they managed to fuse this new style of music that was both a moment of reflecting on their oppression, but also something that was a taste of where they were from, but still filled with hope of where they were hoping to go. And jazz was this brand new form of music. So I wonder, within our limited musical opportunities within churches, whether we could be creating something a little bit more fresh, new, just for your little location with the group of ethnicities that you might have in your congregation. I'd love to see that happen. Same with preaching. I've heard people tell me that they don't like African preaching, like they've written off a whole continent's worth of preaching. Why? Because we've got a particular picture of what a sermon needs to sound like based on our tradition. And you're going, well, I'm not sure, again, that Jesus would have measured up to a lot of those models of preaching that we consider to be normal. Why don't we open ourselves up to other forms of preaching and allow people from different ethnic backgrounds to bring what they've got, and to give them some space to kind of develop that, so they don't have to just measure up to our standards. So I'd love to see us trying to reboot worship like that. I think the next area I want to talk very briefly about, because time is of the essence, is what does it look like to reconsider missions? So again, even in our language, we're often talking about doing mission to other places as if those places have got very little they can offer us. I was in a really interesting class in Regent College in Vancouver, where we had a really multinational group, and I just allowed them to have a free-for-all discussion. And one guy, I think he was from Uganda, he said, would you stop outsourcing the discipleship of your young people to my country? You know, we don't need your teenagers to come to our country so that they can grow as Christians. You know, they come over here and they build walls that don't stand up because they got no training. They spent thousands of pounds getting here and they polluted the ozone layer as a result. Keep your young people. If you're doing it just so that they can grow, do it at home. You know, instead, if you want to help us, then come alongside us and empower us. Just don't dump your young people on us as their development. I thought, oh man, that's a really interesting picture, isn't it? Think about the last time you saw a positive picture of Latin America or Africa in a missionary piece of literature. Too many times it's still described as a dark continent, or we've got to go and help the poverty. We are part of the miscuing of a misrepresentation of what the good things are going on in those countries. So beware of that. And again, don't get me started on orphanages or we'll be here all day, which is also a colonial export to the rest of the world. Reach out to other groups. Look, there are ethnic groups in Scotland. Right, there are. I know that Scotland is a destination point for people coming from Hong Kong. You can see from my background, I'm part of a little movement to try and encourage the UK church to play its part in welcoming Hong Kongers. 130,000 people are coming to the UK from Hong Kong, and many have already arrived in places like Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen. So what does it look like for us to welcome these groups into our churches so that we don't repeat the past that happened to Makami and to a lot of the Windrush generation that came to our churches thinking they're coming home to brothers and sisters, but we're told that they'd be better off down the road with people like themselves. Let's reach out across some of those boundaries. If you have a monocultural church, what would it look like to do a joint service with another church that might be of a different ethnicity? What does it look like to do that with the Chinese church or the Nigerian church or the Lebanese church that might be meeting in another part of the city where you are based? What could that look like as a first step? Or at least pulpit exchanges and preaching groups which include different voices. You also don't need to pray for the world anymore. You can pray with the world. What about every time that you're going to have a prayer meeting, making sure through one of your mission partners that you could actually have a person from the nation where you've got a missionary interest, helping you understand how to pray for their nation and also praying for your nation? What would that look like? Okay, last two, relate to this cultural moment. Okay, this is a moment. Race is huge right now. And if your church preaching program is not engaging with race, you are not equipping your church, A, to live out the gospel. And if we don't equip them to live out the gospel, they'll probably live out a method of contradicting that gospel, that God loves the world. But also we're not equipping them to speak the gospel into this moment. I believe the gospel is the hope that we have in the pursuit of racial justice. A lot of the racial justice conversation is very, very cynical and it's incredibly pessimistic. That is not a Christian frame, right? We are a people of hope. We believe in Jesus coming back again, and we believe that one day every tribe and tongue will be gathered around the throne of Christ, worshipping him in all the beauty of that diversity. So we believe racial justice kind of wins the day, and so we want to make sure that the world gets a taste of that right now. And so we must preach about it. We must equip people for it. If you're running a discipleship program, race needs to be part of that conversation. You need to be able to read the Bible with your eyes attentive to these issues so that we're not just whitewashing them out. Lastly, read widely. Folu said, do your homework, and he's right. 3 books that I would just really quickly recommend to you, and again, we can email these out to you if that would be helpful. So one is a book by Ben Lindsay called We Must Talk About Race. Another one is a book by Chinny MacDonald, which has just come out, which is called God Is Not a White Man. It's literally brand new and out. And I would recommend reading some of the kind of more radical literature, just so that you've got an understanding of how language is being used. And I'd probably recommend Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which is called Between the World and Me. There you go, 3 minutes over, but I wanted to give you all 10. So thank you very much for having me. And Kay, back over to you.
Thanks so much, Krish. Thank you, Makami, so much. Makami's made a really helpful comment in the chat. So if you haven't had a read of that, please do, around the need to invite people in so they're known, so that representation and leadership will begin to change. Can I recommend, if this is not teaching my granny how to suck eggs, that as you look back over the notes that you've taken today, look for one thing, one concrete thing that you might go on to do as a result of this session today that's been full of rich wisdom and experience. But if we just go away with a full notebook, nothing changes. Ascend have been on a massive journey over the last year. It started with one conversation and it went from there, and we have been journeying and changing, and we'd love to see the church continue to do the same. So one thing, we're going to be in touch. Chris has put another seminar in the session, is that right? Yep. And we'd really encourage you to link up with anything that he's got going on. The Ascend website for the Church of Scotland has events on it where we will continue to let you know about things that are happening. We'll be in touch around details from today, book recommendations, that kind of thing. You might want to take something like study leave to do a bit more research, a bit more thinking in this area. Ascend will help you with that too. And then we have a couple more webinars coming up in June, one around new and changing